Hi, everybody. I'm Roland Kuhn of the National Research Council of Canada. That's NRC for you. And I gave a talk on this project, the Indigenous Languages Technology Project at NRC last year, and now I'm giving you an update. But I imagine most of you didn't see my presentation last year. So this project started in March 2017 when the NRC, my employer, got $6 million in the federal budget to assist Indigenous language communities with their languages. And the project has been running ever since, and we're quite proud of it. So our challenges at the start of this project included social challenges, which are on this screen, and then some other challenges on the next screen. The social challenges are obviously governments at various levels in Canada have a bad record. We all know about it with Indigenous communities. And interestingly, academics have a bad record too. Not all academics, of course, but some academics have taken a rather exploitative view of Indigenous data. Promised to help communities, collected data, got tenure or published articles, and then didn't help the communities afterwards. So building trust was a problem because we wanted to work very closely with communities. And the idea was to build technologies that they want, not a top-down approach, but to talk to Indigenous language activists, people who are trying to assist their ancestral language, and help them with technology if needed. So we took what some articles call the empowerment approach. We recruited an all-Indigenous advisory committee. We also got in touch with a lot of local Indigenous language activists and asked them, what do you need? Is there any way in which we could write software that could help you? And the idea is to make them autonomous and not have a top-down approach. So the result is we ended up with a bunch of diverse software projects that I'll be explaining, and they may seem kind of disjointed, but that's because they arise from the needs of individual languages and communities, and they don't all have the same needs. We were very careful not to claim ownership of anything coming out of the project. It's either open source or if it involves private, for instance, linguistic data, it belongs to the community. Nothing is kept by NRC or by the federal government. And so a bunch of apparently somewhat disjointed software projects to help languages, but the advantage is we got to work with some amazing people. I said there were also some other challenges beyond the whole issue of trust. Linguistically, most of the Indigenous languages in Canada are polysynthetic, which in a layman's terms means the verbs, usually it's the verbs, sometimes the nouns are incredibly complicated. Those of us Anglophones who've studied French, if you're thinking of the Becherel, forget it. These languages tend to be much, much, much more complicated. Learning how verbs work is really hard. Most of these languages have a dialect continuum, and of course we didn't want to be seen to favor one dialect over another. That's none of our business. There's a demographic challenge. Often elders in the community are ones who speak the language fluently, but they may not be comfortable with technology. On a software level, we wanted to develop scalable technologies that would help more than one language. We wanted to, as I already mentioned, develop software that that amplifies community efforts. No top-down agendas here. And finally, we wanted the software to be open source and not have proprietary data formats. So when Europeans and Indigenous people in North America first made contact, there were several different language families. Now, to be very clear, a language family means a group of languages that are totally different from languages in another family. The way, say, English is different from Chinese. So each of these colored spaces here represents a language family, and within each family you have languages which may or may not be mutually comprehensible. But the languages from different families are as different from each other's. English is from Chinese as from Arabic. In terms of today's, the situation of Indigenous languages in Canada today, This is from the 2016 census. It may not be completely accurate. There were some issues with collecting data from some communities, but basically you can see there are languages that still have a fairly large number of speakers, Cree being one of them. You can see that's the biggest bubble. Inuktitut up north is a fairly big language by Canadian standards, 37,000 speakers in 2016 roughly, and in addition it has the advantage of being a language of government of Nunavut. Then you have also much smaller languages. The smallest language we worked with, at least in terms of the number of speakers back in 2016, was Tsimshian on the west coast, which you can see down in the right-hand corner. But some of the smaller languages, including Tsimshian, have amazing language revitalization activities. So it's very likely the numbers would be much higher for that one today and for some of the other smaller ones. We all know about the unfortunate history, the nasty history of residential schools and the 60s scoop. These were efforts led by governments and churches to basically eradicate Indigenous cultures in Canada and the languages along with them. Fortunately, they weren't successful. They did succeed in diminishing the number of speakers of most languages, but the languages survived. And these days, as you see at the bottom part of this slide, there are very active efforts in many communities to bring the languages back to having most people in the community speak them. And that's been the really positive aspect of this project for me, is getting to know the amazing people who are doing that within communities. And remember, our goal at NRC is not to do that work, it's to help the people who are doing the work if we can and if they're interested. So the NRC team, which I have the honor to lead, is on the left here. The Indigenous Advisory Committee is on the right. These are people who are themselves Indigenous and involved in Indigenous language revitalization for a whole bunch of different languages. And one person there, Delaney Lothian, a very brilliant young person, we sort of poached from our own Indigenous Advisory Committee, and she now works part-time for the NRC on, as it happens, Michif. And if I have time, you'll see a little bit about her work. There's a slide on that. We got more money than we'd originally planned for from the federal, well, we are federal government, but from Treasury Board. So we ended up funding some external activities too. So I call the activities that were mainly carried out inside NRC by NRC employees, with help though from Indigenous collaborators, inner ring subprojects, and I'll be talking about some of those. And then there were other ones, outer ring subprojects, which were mostly run outside NRC, but we help provide funding. So Readalongs, this is one of the big sub-projects, and it turned out to be very popular. We've worked with many participating communities on this. This is inner ring mostly people from NRC working on it, although someone from Nuance, David Daines, provided a lot of help. And Carleton University, and especially a gentleman called Del Torcornu, helped a lot. And in fact, this whole idea of Readalongs was originally a Carleton University idea. And this is the concept. There we go. Many communities have audiobooks or videos that are with speech in the language and text in the language, as you see here. I can't unfortunately play this live, but you can imagine somebody is speaking these words. So all we do with Readalong Studio is automatically align, using computer software, the speech with the text. So as somebody is telling this story, this one is in Gitxsan, a West Coast language, the word currently being spoken is highlighted. And if the listener, who's probably a student, wants, they can stop the playback and just click on the word and hear it being pronounced, and slow down the pronunciation if they want to master it. This is enormously popular with Indigenous educators. It's a very, very useful tool. A lot of communities have videos like this, but they didn't previously have the speech and the text aligned. So all credit goes to Carleton for aligning them, for coming up with the idea. All we did at NRC was semi-automate the process. So now we in the Carleton team can do this speech text alignment much faster. And we've done it for a whole bunch of languages. So the current situation is communities send us audiobooks or videos, and we run them through our Readalong Studio software, and then they get the speech text alignment, and we send the video back to them in this format, which educators and learners really, really like. So there's some technique. I mentioned the difficulty of conjugating verbs in most Indigenous languages spoken in Canada. And it was Brian Maracle, Oenadeka is his Mohawk name, who called our attention to this as a situation where we could help educators. Basically, he said, look, conjugating verbs in my language, Ganyan-Gea, Mohawk, is very, very hard to teach and to learn. What if, and you can't, it would be impossible, you'd have to print a stack of books, like several stories high, to print out all the possible Mohawk verb conjugations. It's not like the Becherel et al. For French, which is a tiny little book. Why don't we, maybe you could do this in software, and we'll see if my students and teachers would find it useful. So we worked with him and educators at his school, which is at Six Nations in southwestern Ontario. And later, when it turned out it was a good idea, the verb conjugator works really well as a teaching tool, we decided to turn out a version in the eastern dialect of Mohawk, of Ganyan-Gea, with the help of the gentleman there on the right, Aguirre-Deca Martin. So currently, for the Mohawk language, Ganyan-Gea, we have two versions of this verb conjugator. This is what students were using before we implemented the verb conjugator for Mohawk in these two dialects in software. And this is the software version, or one version of the user interface. We worked very closely with the Six Nations School and later with Aguirre-Deca Martin in Ganewaga on this to make the user interface convivial, user-friendly. And it's being used in both these places. More recently, as I said originally early on in this presentation, we don't want to do stuff just for one language, even an important one like Ganyan-Gea. So we're using the same software framework for creating verb conjugators for two other languages, Michif, the ancestral language of the Métis, and the version of Algonquin spoken at Kitigon-Zibi, which is north of Ottawa. And these two languages, as it happens, Michif, the language of the Métis, and the Kitigan-Zibi language are related to each other, but they're not the least bit related to Mohawk. So the two completely different language families there. So we've shown we can build verb conjugators for languages from different families that are both polysynthetic. We've been working on tools for Inuktitut or Inuktitut. Inuktitut is like a group of related languages, of which Inuktitut is probably the most widely spoken in Nunavut. We have a sub-project where we've collaborated with the Legislative Assembly of Nunavut and an Inuit-run organization called the Pirovik Center to create an aligned corpus, a body of text with English sentences in parallel with Inuktitut sentences, 1.3 million aligned sentence pairs, and this can be used to create machine translation systems. So we've released this openly with a lot of help from the Nunavut Assembly, and it can be used to create machine translation systems between these two languages. And in fact, there was a recent competition, international competition, where various researchers across the world competed using this as a basis to produce machine translation between those two languages. Now, to be fair, this is not yet at a level where the quality is good enough to be useful to human translators. However, we've also been working on tools that are currently useful to human translators. There's a search engine for Inuktitut. You can search in Inuktitut or in English and find sentence pairs to help you know what things mean or how you would translate something. There's a morphological analyzer that breaks up these long, complicated Inuktitut or Inuktitut words into small pieces and explains what the pieces mean, and so on. There's a gister. There's tools that people working with Inuktitut can use. There's a spell checker, although since different people from different dialects prefer different spellings, it just underlines words the system thinks might be misspelled and asks the user, you can change this if you like. Other subprojects. So now I'm getting more into the outer ring, projects that we funded but weren't heavily involved with. At a place called CRIM, Centre de Recherche Informatique de Montréal, where I used to work years ago. They're experts on speech technology, and they got a contract from us, from NRC, to work on services, well, partly to work on services that make working with speech data in Indigenous languages more productive, faster, and also to work on automatic speech recognition. So they created free services that make the early stages of working with speech data, for instance, from elders, much faster. And two professors at Carleton, at least, and I believe other researchers too, report a big speed up in the early stages of processing data from different languages. These two researchers, Chris Cox and Olivia Salmons, worked on Tsuut'ina and Michif, and they found this software from CRIM really useful. The CRIM people also carried out speech recognition experiments on Inuktitut and East Cree. We weren't expecting them to create full automatic speech recognition because that's really hard. It's a very hard problem. It's taken decades to achieve it for languages like English and Chinese and so on. But they got a really interesting result. They were able to get good speaker-dependent results, which means you could imagine a scenario where you record speech from an elder, say 70 hours, you transcribe the first 2 hours by hand, laboriously, then you train a system for that speaker, and then it does a first draft of the remaining 68 hours. So this is a really big step. I mentioned Delaney Lothian earlier. She did this work at the University of Alberta, but we've now lured her to the NRC, and although she's working on a master's at University of Alberta, she created a game called Sound Hunters for teaching the phonemes of, I won't try to pronounce the real name of the language, but in English it's Plains Cree. The idea is you're played a sound and you have to decide, if you look at the screen on the right, you have to decide which of the deer on the right represents that sound. And if you shoot it, the system will tell you you got the right thing. So this is an educational game for the early stages of learning the sounds, the phonemes and syllables of a language. And she's currently working on a version of this game for Michif. Finally, we helped fund some online language courses. There's a language course at on Kwakwala, a language course in Naskapi, which is spoken on the East Coast, and for Michif, which is spoken in the Plains, which I've mentioned earlier, the ancestral language of the Métis. So, and we worked with and helped fund both the communities and 7,000 Languages, which is a non-profit organization, and the communities collected language data and worked with 7,000 Languages with help of our funding to create language courses for these languages. There are other sub-projects too, but I don't have time to describe them. If you want to learn more, future work. I spoke of some sub-projects. What are our priorities for the future? We want to extend the software we've already built, the Readalongs, the verb conjugators, sound hunters, and so on, to new languages. We especially want to make our software more user-friendly. So, for instance, for the Readalongs, the ideal situation would be communities use our software inside their community to turn their audiobooks into Readalongs, and they don't need to consult us at all. We'd like to make communities fully autonomous. And finally, we're exploring a new technological opportunity, which many Indigenous educators are very enthusiastic about, speech synthesis. So we've already hooked up speech synthesis for Mohawk, Ganyan Gea, to the Mohawk verb conjugator. And the teachers at Six Nation tells us it sounds really good. Like, we don't want to, obviously help turn out students who speak an Indigenous language in robotic voices. Apparently, this initial experiment is working out pretty well. The system already sounds pretty good. And one of us, Aidan Pine, has already been doing preliminary experiments on 2 other unrelated languages. And again, the initial results sound pretty good. So if you want more information, here's our regularly updated webpage on the project. There's a detailed technical report, or you can get in touch with me. I work for you if you're Canadian. I'm paid by the taxpayer, and I'm happy to answer questions about the project by email. So I think I'm still okay on time. So that's it for me.